If you enjoy educational content on this platform ranging from science to the humanities to history, there is also a good chance that you might have stumbled across a channel called CGP Grey. Now, there really is no through line to the videos that he produces, but rather, people come for the detailed yet understandable summations of large bodies of research, voiced by CGP Grey's soothing voice, often to a rhythmic script, and put to delightful visuals of stick figures wandering around the forest of all knowledge. And if you stumbled across this channel, there's also a good chance you've also watched this video titled You Are Too. Now, before we get into the analysis, let me just address Mr. CGP. Can I call you Grey? I'm just going to call you Grey. Let me just address Grey and his audience directly. First of all, Grey, congratulations! As of writing this, you just recently announced that your channel is about to pass 1 billion lifetime views, which I was not aware of when I started doing the research for this video, so this might be a little bit awkward in terms of timing, but I just want you to know my heartfelt congratulations nonetheless. I just want to make clear that this is not meant to be a personal attack or anything like that, a slight against your character. This is not a hit piece. I've been a big fan of yours for years, and while I do have a number of disagreements with you on a variety of topics, I admire your work both in terms of production as well as your approach to research, and I was even a Patreon backer for a little bit. So this is not meant to be a personal attack. This is purely motivated by the fact that I have an academic disagreement with your interpretation of the literature with respect to split-brain patients and the resulting implications regarding consciousness and the self. And disagreements in the academic discourse are healthy. That's how knowledge is advanced at the end of the day. And while we are not scientists in the formal sense, we are science communicators. So addressing disagreements for lay audiences is just as important as disagreements between scientists within the literature itself. Also, this video is more than just a response video. I'm more or less using Grey's video as a jumping off point for a number of misconceptions about the split brain phenomenon that I've heard repeated time and again, even within the literature itself. So, with all that out of the way, let's get down to brass tacks. Citations are listed in the description, as always, if you want to read them for yourself, and I highly recommend that you do. However, it's a lot of reading. A month's worth, to be precise. You Are Too is Grey's brief synopsis and speculation on the body of research on split-brain patients, those who have had their corpus callosum and sometimes deeper connections, called commissures, severed, and have the two hemispheres of the cortex largely cut off from one another. Now, Grey's central thesis in this video is that we observe in these individuals a variety of behaviors that lends itself to the idea that there is a separate conscious agent observing and responding to questions and stimuli outside of the part of yourself that you think of as you. It's a bold claim, the idea that you are two entities in one skull. It's one of those claims that elicits a gut feeling in people that they generally don't like, a crisis of identity, the shaking of the idea of what it means to be yourself. Now, even before I went to college and studied psychology, I always had a problem with this video in general and Grey's take on the matter. Things just didn't seem to add up in the argument. But for the most part, I just kind of moved on. My undergraduate education didn't really focus on the split brain phenomenon. Like most types of structural brain damage, I knew that it was useful for identifying certain neurological functions, but that's really as far as the discussion went into the topic specifically. I recently came back to Grey's video, and apparently I just can't leave a thing well enough alone. Now, I take issue with the framing of the matter as Grey presents it, and the thing that bothers me the most probably is that this is probably a large amount of people's only exposure to this body of research, which is a shame, because it's far from the whole story, and the bigger story is very fascinating. So, are you too? The short answer is no. From the evidence I was able to compile, that does not seem to be the most likely conclusion. But the long answer is going to take a bit more explaining, and I think I might have lost the thread a little bit, so let's see if we can make sense of all this together, shall we? Now, I normally wouldn't do this, but just in case, I've had a emergency reset button installed into this video, so if I feel like we're losing the thread or getting off track or I start rambling, all I gotta do is slam on that button right there and we'll just restart and cut to an ad break. Probably won't need it, but if we do, I'll press it. Scout's honor. Okay, so let's start off with the main points that Grey makes in this video. Obviously, you should go watch the video yourself if you haven't already, so you have a better understanding than my summary can provide. But, assuming that you've done that, I'll proceed. Basically, Grey starts off by saying that the brain is divided up into two hemispheres. Yep, this checks out. Alright, and then he goes on to say that this means that you have two brains. Okay, now 5 seconds into the video, and we've already encountered two major problems. Problem one is the framing. By saying that the two hemispheres are two brains, you frame the conversation to conform to the idea that there are two conscious entities. So, for the purposes of this video, we will be referring to them as two hemispheres, because that is in fact what they are. The second problem is he fails to define what he means by you. He briefly follows up by explaining that the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body and receives sensory input from the left side, and the opposite for the left hemisphere, which controls the right half of the body. But, boiling things down to motor functions and sensory perception is a very poor and reductive working definition for the self at best. And side note, as we'll get into later, this isn't entirely accurate either. We'll get more into that in just a second, so just, bear with me. He goes on to talk about some more classic split-brain experiments that demonstrate selective motor control of the left half of the body, and then goes on to explain that only the left brain, see, there's that framing again, only the left hemisphere can speak. Not entirely true, but more on that in a moment. He then goes on to talk about some other classic split-brain experiments that demonstrate that the split-brain patient will verbally come up with plausible, yet incorrect conclusions to explain the actions of their left hand under certain experimental conditions. Before going into his self-described speculation time, where he proceeds to explain that the two hemispheres have always been independent agents, with the language-dominant left hemisphere dominating control over the right hemisphere. Somewhere in here, he takes another stab at operationally defining the self by making the obvious observation that we do a lot of talking, and a lot of our thinking is done in words. Therefore, language and linguistic thinking are his working definition for one's self for the purposes of his video, and that because there is a separate hemisphere that does not have this linguistic capacity, but still provides necessary functions for consciousness, that this means that there is a conscious agent that we are largely unaware of because of the language-dominant left hemisphere stealing the show, up until the point that the hemispheres are separated. At the end, he puts speculation aside and claims that, at the very least, the evidence points to the idea that there is a separate entity of some sort that hears and responds to questions and experiences the world that is separate from one's linguistic thoughts and therefore from one's perceived consciousness. Where to begin? Well, I guess the best place to start would be to take a look at the sources and get the story straight from the horse's mouth, so let me just take a look at that description real quick, and no citations. So I hate to start out like this, but Gray, what the hell, man? You really didn't make it easy to take a deeper look at your research, and I know you do your research. I couldn't find your citations in the description, no pinned comment, not on your website, I even tried finding them on fucking Reddit. Now, I did email Team Gray about this, requesting their citations as well as briefly describing my aims with this project, but as of recording this, they haven't responded. That being said, I'm not going to harp on this too much. YouTube was, in fact, a very different place 6 years ago, and listening to your citations is more of a recent development in content creation, it would seem, and I definitely didn't list my sources back in the day either, so we're just going to move on. I did a lot of digging, though, to find the sources of the Gray references based on his descriptions of the experiments, but as will become painfully clear later on, this didn't really clear up the matter either. All of which to say, I cannot confirm what sources Gray used for his video, I just wanted to do my due diligence and try and find them. Anyway, okay, where were we? Okay, where are my notes? Okay, that paper was a bit of a bust, some good diagrams though. That was helpful, but oof, that's gonna take a while to explain. Hi. What you doing over there? Wait, no, we don't have a sponsor yet! This video is brought to you by the wonderful people over at Patreon. Now, one of the things I promised myself with this video and all of my content going forward is that I'm going to take as long as it needs to be properly ready. In the past, in an effort to speed up releases of videos, I've sometimes either rushed the research to focus on production value, or rushed production to focus more on the research, neither of which really results in a product that I'm happy about at the end of the day. All in all, from start to finish, this video took a little over 3.5 months to make, and that's also while working 2 jobs. And while I'm very happy with how this video's turned out, I know that I'm never going to be able to make videos like this fast enough to feed the algorithm. So if you like what I'm doing here, and you want to support it, and you want to help me get to a point where I can have more time to work on videos, and thus get them out sooner, then it would be amazing if you could support me on Patreon. The one condition, however, is that if you're living paycheck to paycheck, if you've got a pretty tight budget, save that money for things you actually need. But if you can't afford it, all patrons, regardless of tier, will automatically be credited in every subsequent video, get early access to videos, as well as access to my uncut interviews, as well as any Patreon live streams I end up doing in the future. Now, there is only one other tier, and that's the $5 one, and I'm really excited about it. So if you like the diagrams that I designed for these videos to help demonstrate psychological concepts and models, and you're about to see a lot of them, by the way, then in the $5 tier, you can get access to all of them, Illustrator or Photoshop files depending on how I made them, as well as high-quality JPEG and PNG exports, as well as some short animations, which you're free to use however you'd like. One quick caveat, particularly with the anatomical models, I do put a lot of work and use a lot of references to try and ensure that I make my graphics as accurate as possible. However, I am literally not qualified to make professional, scientifically accurate anatomical diagrams, so consider them to be high-quality graphics rather than true diagrams, the sort you would find in a textbook. But the idea is, with that caveat in mind, if you're currently in school in the high school, undergraduate, or graduate level, and you need some graphics to make your PowerPoint presentation stand out, boom, I got you. If you work in education as a teacher and you want some additional graphics to use in your PowerPoints or as teaching aids, here they are. Now, in addition to the graphics, you'll also get access to my research notes for my videos. I often handwrite my notes, so apologies in advance for the legibility. Now, if enough people sign up on Patreon, I might be able to have the time to type them up after the fact, but I do take better notes when I handwrite them, so fair warning. Again, I want to say thank you to all of you who are already donating on Patreon, and thank you to all of you watching. And now, back to the video. Biology has a tendency towards symmetry. You have 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 kidneys, and so forth. Now, for the most part, save for a couple of organs, splitting you in half would yield 2 extremely similar halves that mirror each other. Picat's law of symmetry with respect to the brain was the assumption that both hemispheres of the brain mirrored each other in their function. If there was a region in the right hemisphere that performed a particular function, one could assume that a mirror image of that region would perform the same function in the left hemisphere. Now, this is largely true for sensations, perceptions, and motor functions. However, in the 1860s, Paul Broca and Gustav Dax independently identified a left-lateralized, or existing only in the left hemisphere region of the brain, that was responsible for speech production, which did not have an analog in the right hemisphere. This region, as any intro to psych student knows, came to be known as Broca's area, and not Dax's area, for reasons, I'm assuming. And it'll become very important later, so, just put a pin in that real quick. This marked the first in many discoveries that would demonstrate that while the brain looks highly symmetrical, functionally speaking, the 2 hemispheres have very different functional strengths and weaknesses. Fast forward to the 1940s, where the history of the split brain phenomenon, as it came to be known, began with intractable epilepsy. Now, research into non-human primates prior to this had demonstrated that epileptic seizures can discharge from one hemisphere to the other via what's called the corpus callosum, which is a dense mass of neuronal tissue that connects the 2 hemispheres, enabling the majority of cortical communication. However, there are other connections between the hemispheres, such as the anterior commissure and the hippocampal commissure, as well as subcortical connections that go all the way down to the brainstem. So it isn't entirely accurate to say that severing the corpus callosum completely cuts off the 2 hemispheres from each other, but the corpus callosum is the largest and clearly facilitates the largest amount of communication, somewhere around like 90%, but more on the sneaky deets of that later. Now, because of the nature of seizure discharge, it was hypothesized by researchers named William van Wegenen and York Heron that if the corpus callosum was severed, the discharge of seizures could be more controlled. Kind of like a fire line on a crop field, the idea was to prevent the spread of seizures from growing to a point where the patient would lose consciousness, and thereby prevent long-term or permanent damage. As described in their paper, local seizures that don't spread far beyond the original focal point are much more manageable for the patient. And this led to the first partial callosotomies, or attempted removal of the corpus callosum in humans. Now, unfortunately, these early procedures were not successful in seizure reductions, probably because they didn't fully sever the corpus callosum. Now, you might be wondering if anyone stopped to ask if this would have negative behavioral effects, and yeah, there was. Dr. A.J. Akalaitis from the University of Rochester, shortly after Wegener and Heron's original callosotomies, conducted cognitive tests on their patients. However, the cognitive tests he employed were not sophisticated enough or tailored properly to identify the particular effects that callosotomy had on cognition and behavior. However, he did determine that the patient's personalities and their IQ scores remained consistent post and pre-surgery. So this failed attempt at controlling seizure spread was more or less seen as a no harm, no foul kind of situation. However, in 1962, Philip Vogel and Joseph Bogen attempted again, trying to perform a complete commissurotomy this time, or severing the entire corpus callosum and the other commissures. However, later MRI imaging would confirm that many of these early patients did not have a full commissure split like they originally thought, but they did fully sever the corpus callosum, or at least enough to where they achieved seizure control. The first of their procedures was in a former paratrooper who was suffering from life-threatening seizures known as WJ. Now get used to initials because we're going to see a lot of them. Vogel and Bogen's thinking was that Vagan and Heron were on the right track, but the corpus callosum needed to be fully severed for the procedure to work, and possibly the other commissures too. This was in fact the case, and the procedure became a viable treatment for intractable epilepsy. And it is here where modern split brain research really began. In the following years, Michael Gazzaniga, Roger Sperry, and Joseph Bogen adapted techniques that had been previously used in split-brain animal studies, largely by Roger Sperry himself, to human subjects who had undergone callosotomy. This is the era where the canon of the split-brain phenomenon was established, and the experiments that Grey cites were conducted. These experiments looked at what lateral differences existed between the hemispheres. Since the hemispheres are now cut off from each other, as long as you isolate the stimuli given to one hemisphere from the other, you can determine the cortical specializations of the two. If one hemisphere can't respond to a stimulus with a specific cognitive function, that's a lateralized function. Now, you would think that if you presented a stimulus to the left eye, you'd send a signal to the right hemisphere and vice versa for the right eye. However, as will become more and more evident as we get into the topic, the central nervous system is annoyingly redundant. Instead of the right eye sending a signal to the left hemisphere and the left eye sending a signal to the right hemisphere, half of both retinas send an ipsilateral or same-side signal, and the other half of both retinas send a contralateral or opposite side signal. So it's more like the right half of both retinas capturing visual information from the left half of your visual field send a signal to the right hemisphere, and the left half of both retinas capturing visual information from your right visual field send their signal to the left hemisphere, leaving you with two visual half fields. Now, we're going to be dealing with a lot of left equals right and right equals left and mirroring and double mirroring, and it's all very confusing and easy to get mixed up. So just try and untwist your brain and bear with me. Now, with all this in mind, in order to isolate the visual half fields, you need to have the patient fixate on a singular point to prevent eye movement from confounding your data. A task that is easier said than done, and more recent split brain studies that have the benefit of eye tracking software have shown to be more difficult of a task than you would initially think. Ideally, though, when the eyes fixate on that central point, you could present a visual stimulus to one hemisphere specifically by presenting it to the area of the vision where there is no overlap between the visual half fields. Now, what all of these early experiments seem to consistently report and demonstrate is that these split brain patients appear to have a left side agnosia, or lack of knowledge, which is to say in this context that they cannot describe or elaborate on stimuli presented to the right hemisphere, whether that stimuli be visual, auditory, olfactory, tactile, you name it. However, in the case of these stimuli, the left half of their body can respond to the stimulus. Now, this discussion of laterality can get infinitely more complicated if you factor in left-handed and ambidextrous people who have a much higher chance of having the hemispheric functions flipped. And there's even some evidence of structural differences in the commissures, but we're not going to get into that. That is definitely a topic for another video, and I know you've already seen the runtime. So just know that when we talk about the left and the right hemispheres and their functions, this is not universal, just the most typical neuroanatomical organization in humans. So when I refer to the left and the right hemispheres having certain specializations, that a number of individuals have this paradigm actually reversed. But it really doesn't influence the larger discussion in any meaningful way, just everything that I'm going to say for some people is the opposite. And we're going to have a lot of opposites today, so it's, in the spirit of things. That being said, though, the nature of the split brain phenomenon understandably brings up questions regarding our subjective, conscious human experience. And if you have questions, know that you are not alone. Any psychologist, neuropsychologist, or neurologist will admit that we have far more questions about the nature of the subjective side of consciousness than we have answers. And look, just to get this out of the way, I don't have the answers to these fucking questions either. I'm a fucking idiot. And I know a lot of you just agree with that way too fast, but the point being that this video owes a lot to the hard work from scientists over the decades whose bodies of work I have heavily cited for this script, and I don't think I'd have as good of a grasp on this topic even with reading all of the material that I did if I hadn't have talked to some experts.
So what you see is like, hey, so if we focus on the visual system, the retina just well, of course, you know that the retina just has these optins, right? These light-sensitive molecules that produce electricity in response to just light falling on them. You have 100 million photon cells in your eye. These project to 1 million ganglion cells. They just average, basically. And now you just get a signal like, hey, at this location, there is light of a certain wavelength, or there isn't.
Right.
So there's some basic calculations already done just behind your eye, basically. In the retina itself, detecting motion and so on. And then you progress through a system. And these are really simple detectors that are there. Like the LGN basically detects boundaries. V1, for 40% of the neurons in V1, we know exactly what they're doing. And it's really simple stuff like detecting contours, detecting certain colors at certain locations, so on, like stuff that you can currently implement on an iPhone. So, and then that deepest mystery is like, why would that give rise to any visual experience? So it's pretty easy to draw out these streams of information. But if I tell you like, hey, I just made, I just upgraded my Android phone or something, and now it does what I just described to you, what the visual cortex does, you'll be like, okay, so what? Like I'm sure you can classify information and so I'm like, wow, it's so mysterious. You're like, huh, well, what? That's not mysterious at all. It's like just some chain reactions that anybody can build in. But if I would then say, and now this phone actually has visual experiences, and somehow I can convince you of the fact that that's true, then it's like, what? You just added some simple detectors, and boom, all of a sudden, this doesn't happen in the darkness anymore, right? So that's the hard problem of consciousness.
Now, we'll get into why I reached out to Dr. Pinto specifically in a bit, but I just wanted to thank him first of all for being gracious enough to take some time out of his busy day to discuss his paper and its findings with me over Zoom. It was close to finals when I reached out, and I think it was the week before finals when we actually did the interview, and we went 15 minutes over our original 15 minutes that he had taken out for the interview. So I hope I didn't throw a wrench in your day, and I really appreciate you coming on. And I just gotta tell you guys, nothing reminds me of how much I have left to learn about psychology than talking to an expert in the field. So a huge thank you to Dr. Pinto for agreeing to do this interview with me, and if you want to see the full interview, like I said before, it'll be available on Patreon. Now, Gray in his video raises a controversial, and I'm going to say counterintuitive, solution to the split brain question. That there was always a separate conscious entity, a silent passenger, if you will, that was living and experiencing the world and having its own thoughts and emotions and experiences that was overpowered by the linguistic left hemisphere, which was unaware of its existence. Now, he doesn't just assert that post-callosotomy a new conscious agent is born, but rather that even in the intact brain, there are two conscious agents. Your brain and my brain. You are two. And only one of them is what you think of as you. And if you have any qualms with this claim whatsoever, he has a very handy Kafka trap to ensnare you with.
You might not agree and may be arguing right now why it can't be possible, exactly as we would expect talking left brain to do.
So to be fair to Gray, he is not the only one to call the two hemispheres two brains. Gazzaniga in his write-ups also often refers to them in this way. In his 1967 review on split brain research, he titled it The Split Brain in Man, with the subtitle, The Human Brain is actually two brains, each capable of advanced mental functions. When the cerebrum is divided surgically, it is as if the cranium contained two separate spheres of consciousness.
And then did this have a detrimental effect? I mean, no, it had a very detrimental effect. I mean, first of all, Yeah, indeed, in the field, like, so this is one of the cornerstones of one of the big theories of consciousness, namely IIT, where they're like, hey, if you cut, if there's no longer massive communication, you get two conscious agents. And they are like, this says something very, and it's even further than that. Like Sperry himself also says, like, hey, this proves materialism. Like, this proves if I cut the brain in two, you get two persons. Like, this is the most direct proof we have so far of physicalism.
So I understand how one would get to this conclusion and feel comfortable in calling the two hemispheres two brains, but I think Gazzaniga is also framing the discussion in a loaded way. Now, to get this out of the way, a callosotomy or commissurotomy separates the two cortical hemispheres, cortex meaning surface. Beneath the cortex is the subcortical brain, which is not hemispherically divided. While you can't surgically divide the subcortex, you can remove the entire cortex from the subcortex sometimes without killing the organism. You're no longer left with anything even closely resembling the organism that was before, or anything even remotely conscious for that matter, as we understand it. But they can still maintain homeostasis and can respond to stimuli even if not in a conscious way. So one could argue, and this is admittedly a false equivalency, that you have three brains, two cortical hemispheres and one subcortical brain. Now, I don't think this is a very good argument, and it is not equivalent to Gazzaniga and Grey's argument, but my point is, when you call the divided cortex two brains, you're ignoring a big part of the brain.
For people who don't work, so I've worked with lots of patients, right? Also with lesion patients.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, yeah, so at any rate, for people who don't work with neural data, with the brain, there's almost this idea of like, oh, there's something magical about the brain, right? So they're like, yeah, okay, there's information entering your eye. Well, that still seems okay, straightforward, but then it goes into the brain, and there, the most complex thing, and like this is what you always read in popular press, right? Like there's more connections there than in the universe, blah, blah. Okay, but when you actually look at it, like, first of all, I'm sure you heard the number 85 billion, referring to the number of cells in the brain. Well, 65 billion of those are in your cerebellum. So your cerebellum just does your fine motor movements. If you lose that, yeah, you display behavior that seems like you're moving around like you're drunk or something, but barely impairs your consciousness. So 65 of the 85 billion neurons are really, I mean, I wouldn't say they don't do anything, but you can lose them and still basically be you.
The point is that I am refraining from referring to the split brain as two brains, and I'll be referring to them as two hemispheres, because that's what they are. And it is important to remember that split brain patients still have a mostly intact brain, and to describe the two hemispheres as two brains not only ignores a major part of the organ, but also is overly simplistic and, in my opinion, frames the argument in a loaded way. Furthermore, when Gazzaniga says that each brain is capable of advanced mental functions, what he actually means is that both hemispheres can independently perform basic sensory motor tasks and answer simple questions independently and simultaneously. Now, as we'll get into later, it is not just language that is left-lateralized, but problem solving and elaboration and potentially the sense of self. So when you say advanced function, this is a relative term. Now, the right hemisphere specializes in visuospatial tasks, and that is an advanced cognitive function, just like the left hemisphere specialization in language. But colloquially, saying advanced function is entirely relative to what a person thinks of when they think of advanced. Does it mean that both hemispheres exhibit equal senses of self? Because that is a reasonable thing to conclude from this framing. This is a question of semantics on a real level. The way we talk about things is important, and it is important not to confuse discussions of findings with language that implies more than the findings actually demonstrate. This is how gross misrepresentations of science proliferate public discourse, and while this is not the worst example of that by any means, people reading this might still be inclined to see the independent actions of each hemisphere indicating a higher sense of self in the right hemisphere than is actually demonstrated. Now, when you sever the cortical commissures, yes, both cortexes are in fact conscious. The right hemisphere is experiencing sensations and giving directives to its contralateral half of the body in response to stimuli after the split, just as the left hemisphere is doing. But this does not necessarily mean that the person with a split brain is cut off from half of their visual experience or doesn't control half of their body, as we'll get into very shortly. But furthermore, having experiences and having a sense of identity are two different things. Having a sense of self and identity is not an automatic consequence of basic conscious experience. Now, Gray conflates these two things by asking who is the you in the situation without defining the concept of you, but more on that in a minute. Now, the question can reasonably be raised, and I think it provides important context to answer it. Why do we see so much lateralization in the human brain to begin with? Most animals do not have many, if any, lateralized functions, but rather each function can be found in both hemispheres to roughly equal degrees, Bikatlov symmetry. High degrees of lateralization are most observed in higher-order primates, and most of that is observed in humans. In monkeys, for example, severing the corpus callosum but leaving the anterior commissure intact still enables them to retain the ability to transfer visual information between the hemispheres, while humans have not been shown to be able to do this. In Gazzaniga's summation of the theory, the evidence seems to lend itself to the idea that lateralization in the human brain is a recent evolutionary development, and that it occurred for a very specific reason, in opposition to the dominant theory of the time that these lateralized functions were merely evolutionary add-ons. That is to say, one hemisphere would gain a new ability on top of old ones. Instead, lateralization might have been the result of an intense competition for cortical space that necessitated the loss of certain abilities to make room for new ones. For example, chimpanzees extraordinarily outperform humans in terms of visual memory. However, one hypothesis for why is that the region of their brains that they use for storing visual memories we use for visual imagination. Now, why not just make the brain bigger to solve the problem? That seems to have been the name of the game for the majority of the hominin line up until modern humans. Well, one has to understand the delicate interplay of selective pressures. It's very rare that there's only one selective pressure acting on a population at a time. At any given time, hundreds of pressures can be selecting for numerous different traits which may be difficult to coexist on a purely anatomical level. It's unsurprisingly difficult to adapt to an ever-changing environment using a random system of chance paired with a process of causality that results in beneficial characteristics being carried over to the next generation. That's why over 99% of all species that have ever existed are extinct now. It's a pretty inefficient system. Now, in the hominin lineage, there was obviously a number of selective pressures to have an ever-expanding cognitive and social repertoire, but there were also selective pressures for bipedalism, and the human female pelvis walks a tightrope between these two things, being able to birth a large-headed offspring while also being able to walk efficiently. And there are a number of different ways that humans have adapted for these conflicting anatomical pressures. Obviously, make the head bigger and the pelvis wider, but like we said, that only goes so far, and it's not far enough. Another way to do it is to fragment the skull and to have those sutures harden postnatally or after birth, which is why you have to be extremely careful with babies and their soft little heads. And this, as it turns out, still isn't enough, which is why humans don't finish their gestation period in utero, but are instead more similar to mammals that have been birthed in large litters, despite typical human pregnancies consisting of just one fetus. But even with all of that, our species has kind of hit the cap on how big the brain can be. Now, Gazzaniga, in his 1998 retrospective in Scientific America, states that the evolutionary pressures for new cognitive abilities presented a conundrum in the hominin lineage: gain new advantageous abilities without losing the old ones. The solution to the problem was lateralization. The old ability could be preserved in one hemisphere, while the other hemisphere could sacrifice that cortical space to make room for the new ability, and the connection between the two hemispheres would allow both functions to exist simultaneously and be seamlessly integrated together without any sacrifice. Unless, you sever the cortical commissures or something like that. Let's rewind a bit, back to Gazzaniga, Bogen, and Sperry's 1962 case study on patient WJ, that former paratrooper we mentioned earlier. WJ, at the time of his surgery, was 48 and suffering from grand mal convulsions resulting from war injuries sustained in 1944. In addition to the seizures, he also suffered from minor numbness to the left side of his body. Apart from that, he was fairly normal, right-handed, IQ was 113, and no significant sensory motor impairments apart from the mild numbness. WJ underwent a full callosotomy, which significantly helped in controlling his seizures and eliminating major convulsive episodes. However, WJ had a rougher time recovering from his callosotomy than other patients, being unable to speak for 30 days after the operation, as well as suffering from temporary paralysis and weakness, which is not normal. By the time Gazzaniga and his colleagues began their investigation, all of these symptoms were reported to have mostly cleared up, with no further details being provided. The first reported finding with WJ involved blindfolding him and giving him objects to hold in his left hand. Under these conditions, he was perfectly competent at handling familiar objects like pencils, cigarettes, and eyeglasses. However, he was unable to verbally identify or describe any of them. This was identified as a left side agnosia, or lack of knowledge. Essentially, WJ's hand was operating normally, but he was reportedly consciously unaware of its actions and could not verbally describe them. One additional observation was that even though WJ was right-handed, prior to his surgery, he could legibly write with his left hand. However, post-surgery, his left hand could no longer write words, just meaningless scribble. A battery of tests was conducted with WJ, which generally showed that his left and right hands were able to competently perform tasks by themselves as long as stimulation was shown to the corresponding hemisphere. But tasks that required both hands were now extremely difficult, meaning that WJ had severely impaired cross-integration skills. This is also where the first case of visual half-field agnosia in the split brain was reported, where WJ could respond with his left hand to stimuli presented to his left visual half-field, but couldn't describe it verbally. WJ's wife also provided some helpful observations, although Gazzaniga and colleagues did not observe these behaviors themselves. This is where some of the observations about split brain patients that Grey talks about comes from, where the patient will go to pick something up with their right hand only for it to be smacked down by the left. WJ's wife reported that sometimes WJ would pick up the evening paper with his right hand only for his left hand to take it and put it down again, or the right and left hand conflicting when dressing and undressing. This is called apraxia, where motor controls act independently of conscious thought and desire. It is possible, however, that WJ's conflict between left and right motor controls were exaggerated by the particular nuances of his condition. WJ wasn't just a split brain patient. He was a war veteran who sustained traumatic brain injury serious enough to cause life-threatening seizures, which he suffered from for 15 years. Now, when we say that the right hemisphere controls the left half of the body and the left hemisphere controls the right half of the body, this is mostly true. But remember the contralateral and ipsilateral signals of the retinas? In the case of motor controls, there's a similar situation going on. Both hemispheres in non-split brains have some ipsilateral control over motor function. With the upper extremities in particular, each half of the brain can control the upper muscles of either arm, but not the muscles in the hands of the ipsilateral side. The brain, unsurprisingly, has redundancies for important functions like controlling your arms. Gazzaniga and colleagues even note that WJ's original injury was suggested to be primarily to the left parietal lobe, and speculate that it might be possible that this pre-callosotomy injury might have more dramatically impaired his ipsilateral motor control and exaggerated his left side agnosia and apraxia. Remember that WJ prior to his callosotomy already had mild numbness to his left side. This could have been tied to his left parietal lobe injury and could have contributed to the specific symptoms he was experiencing. So we can say that WJ does not really provide the ideal subject to make broad claims about split brains and the resultant implications on consciousness. And it's important to note that these sorts of observations were not all universal among split brain patients, but we don't know to what degree they weren't universal. Gazzaniga and Sperry have both noted on the heterogeneity within the split brain population, but not really the specifics. Now, what if I told you that there was a research group that attempted to replicate some of Sperry and Gazzaniga's original findings, only to demonstrate that split brain patients did not, in fact, have a left visual half-field agnosia? In 2016, Dr. Yar Pinto, the gentleman we've been interviewing for this video, and his colleagues published a paper titled Split Brain, Divided Perception, but Undivided Consciousness. They mentioned in the literature review section an interesting aspect of a 1968 paper published by Roger Sperry, titled Hemisphere Deconnection and Unity in Conscious Awareness. Now, I had to dig up this paper for myself, which details some of the major findings Sperry, Gazzaniga, and Bogen had found in the 11 split brain subjects they had at the time. This paper reviews some of the findings that we've already talked about, namely the visual and tactile agnosia described in WJ, and the right hemisphere's ability to react to stimuli with the left hand that the patient will verbally say they did not see, as well as the finding that split brain subjects can perform two simple tasks simultaneously with both hands. Although Sperry does note that integrated tasks or complex tasks are performed much better by neurologically intact people. Generally, the paper sums up the findings in split-brain patients at the time and posits some potential degrees of consciousness of the right hemisphere in the split brain. Sperry sides with the idea that this creates two independent conscious agents, although he does point out that the two hemispheres sharing the same body and experiences likely prevents any major deconnection in experience between the two, even if they are independent conscious agents, which could be why seeing any noticeable differences in split-brain patients versus neurologically intact individuals requires considerable experimental constraints. An interesting thing to note, however, which Pinto and colleagues point out in their paper, is that Sperry says in the last paragraph of that 1968 paper that, quote, "The more we see of these patients, and the more of these patients we see, the more we become impressed with their individual differences and with the consequent qualifications that must be taken into account. Although the general picture has continued to hold up in the main as described, it is important to note that with respect to many of the deconnection symptoms mentioned, striking modifications and even outright exceptions can be found among the small group of patients examined to date." I sure would like to know what those outright exceptions were in those 11 individuals. What these modifications and exceptions are is hard to say, and Pinto and colleagues in their paper note that exceptions to the split-brain canon abound throughout the literature, and specifically designed their study to attempt to replicate Gazzaniga and Sperry's findings from the 60s. In addition to publishing their raw data for this experiment, which is minimal to non-existent for those older papers by Gazzaniga and Sperry, Pinto and colleagues published an entirely separate supplemental paper with all the details regarding their experimental conditions and procedures, as well as transcripts of their interviews with the two participants that they studied, both of whom were asked about their half-field diagnoses, but in terms of their general experience as opposed to a specific stimulus. When asked, "When you fixate on a point, do you feel that you see both the left and the right of the point, or are you blind to one side of the point? Is this the same now as before your operation, or has it changed since your operation?" Patient DDV replied, "I see well, except for the peripheral angles, which appear blurred. This disturbance was not present before the operation." And patient DDC replied to the same question with, "I had a visit from the optician a while ago. Anyways, I see well on both sides. Is the same before and after," referring to the operation. So, even while being unable to describe verbally what they see in their left visual half-fields, both patients express awareness of it. It seems then that they are merely unable to integrate that experience with the specific cognitive function of language rather than having a separate conscious experience outside of their sense of identity. Additionally, when both patients were asked, "Do you feel normal, like you were just one person in your body and brain, or do you sometimes feel that there is another presence? Is this the same as before your operation, or has it changed since your operation?" DDV replied with, "I feel absolutely normal as before the operation." And DDC responded with, "No, that absolutely not," referring to another presence. "Sometimes I think myself that the right arm did an involuntary reflexive movement." I wanted to bring up DDC and DDV's responses to these questions not only to demonstrate that the canon of the split brain phenomenon is more nuanced than the textbooks or Gray describe, but also to ensure that this video is not just me talking about a thing for which I have no experience or personal frame of reference. The lived experience of these people is not just an academic question that can only be talked about in the context of data and experimental findings. The people for whom this is life deserve to have their opinions on whether or not they have two people living in their head heard. So, suffice it to say that the population of split brain patients is highly heterogeneous while also being a very small population, which is striking. Questions like, are these differences a result of actual functional differences between the patients or methodological flaws and inconsistencies throughout the literature, are again hard to answer because of the lack of raw data in those early split brain papers.
Very often there's no data, or if you look at some, so it's like very a narrative style of describing it.
Yeah, that's been a big issue for me, and because like I'm not,
or if there is data, like it seems very flimsy or whatever. So, well, first of all, it could be something that has that's different, that it's changed over time or something, because of course, there have been lots of so lots of findings from the 60s and the 70s have basically been debunked, right? So like the Stanford prison experiment turns out to be completely fabricated, and these kind of things, which had very detrimental impacts. Like the Stanford prison experiment, of course, is canonical, how do you say, example here, where this really influenced policies and so on. And it basically turned out that the lead author there was Zimbardo, that he basically just fabricated the data to further his own career. Well, this is of course terrible, but this was somewhat more. So I guess back in these days, people were much less strict about like, hey, no, you have to be very concrete. Like you have to be very open about exactly the methods you use, exactly what you find, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So this more narrative way, and Sperry basically did the same thing, where he basically just cherry picked some findings. Right. And then generalize these. And if you indeed so you read his 68 paper, he also actually ends that paper by saying, you can also find the exact opposite of what I just found. It's like, what? Like, I mean, that is shocking. And if you write that now we do need to see numbers, right? Like if it's all or none, okay, fine. I don't need to see actual numbers, but if it's not all or none, now I want to see the percentages. So that was also a shock to me, actually.
Okay, so let's get into Pinto and colleagues' experimental findings. While I won't get into every detail of the 5 experiments they conducted, I will say that this paper has a lot of methodological strengths over Sperry and Gazzaniga's early work. And you should definitely go read the paper if you're curious. It's not that long, it's only a few pages. The field of research psychology has definitely become more rigorous over the past 50 to 60 years, and as such, you have a lot better luck getting your hands on raw data with more recent papers. Pinto and colleagues' paper has all of their raw data published, as well as that supplemental paper we talked about earlier, filled with spreadsheets and details of each experimental procedure, and details on the exact stimuli used, and so forth, stuff that wouldn't normally make it into a final paper. Now, the long and short of this paper is that Pinto and colleagues were able to replicate the classic findings that split-brain patients cannot compare visual information observed between the hemispheres. So, if you present a split-brain patient with a stimulus in the left hemisphere and a stimulus in the right hemisphere, and you ask them if the stimuli are the same, they will respond with, I don't know. However, unlike Sperry and Gazzaniga's published findings, according to Pinto and colleagues, if you present a stimulus to the right hemisphere and ask the patient not what the object is, but if there is an object present, they can respond verbally and with their right hand correctly, and vice versa with the left hand responding to visual information presented to the left hemisphere.
So when I started out working with split brain patients, I didn't intend to I completely believed what they had reported. So I didn't think like, hey, now I'm just going to find something. I just happened to find like, no, they can actually respond to things in the left visual field. And so I was like, what? And then I just thought like, this is actually worthwhile to bring to the forefront, basically.
These are extremely contradictory findings to the split brain canon and poke a lot of holes in Gazzaniga and Sperry's original arguments as well as CGP Grey's thesis for his video. There were 2 patients for this study, DDC and DDV. And yes, not only are we dealing with a lot of initials here, but in a single paper, there are 2 patients, one named DDC and DDV. The pain of this has not escaped me. Please bear with me, because it's only going to get worse. Just wait till we get to JW. No, not WJ, the guy we've been talking about. JW, a different split brain patient. Anyway, getting back to the paper, DDV only participated in the first experiment, which is going to make talking about it a lot easier, but DDC participated in the other 4. However, between the 2, DDC had a more severe split, and also had a more severe split than the famous split brain patient, JW.
You mentioned Sperry and Gazzaniga's research, and one of the things that's been hard for me is like figuring out like the degree of split in those patients. It's not I get mixed information.
Same. So it's if anything, like for instance, Joe, their famous patient Joe, of course, JW. He only had a callosotomy, so his anterior commissure was still intact, basically.
Got it.
So basically, the patient DDC that I tested was more split than JW.
Critical to note about this study is that DDC's performance at localizing stimuli, even if the response type was not from the corresponding hemisphere that the stimuli was presented to, was far above chance. Replicating the finding that DDC was not able to compare stimuli between the visual half-fields was really important because it meant that his later ability to localize stimuli regardless of response type or visual half-field was not a result of communication between the 2 hemispheres. So, even though the two hemispheres are cut off from communicating, meaning that their specialized cognitive processes cannot be integrated with the sensory information of the other, the person is still consciously aware of all the information perceived and processed in both hemispheres. So, while the split brain patient can't verbally describe visual information presented to his right hemisphere, this is only because the specialized cognitive process of language cannot interact with that information. But the person still consciously perceives it, because it's, still one person. And in order to prove that this is a conscious perception on the part of DDC and not a subconscious one, experiments 4 and 5 had DDC respond to visual stimuli in both visual half fields on all 3 response types, left hand, right hand, and verbally, and after each trial, DDC was asked to rate his confidence on a scale from 1 to 4 for experiment 4, and on 1 to 5 for experiment 5. I don't know why they had a 4 scale and a 5 scale between the two experiments. I should have asked Dr. Pinto, but, there were more important questions to ask, and we had a limited time. Either way, both of these experiments again showed that DDC was able to demonstrate he had conscious awareness of visual stimuli presented to either half field with any response type, and he was even able to determine the orientation of simple shapes under any condition. But, important to note is that his successful trials were always accompanied with high confidence ratings. Bear in mind, stimuli were presented at either 100 milliseconds or 120 milliseconds for each trial, which is very fast, the point of which is to prevent a ceiling effect, but you don't care about the boring math of that. Either way, a high correlation between success and confidence is a pretty good indication of conscious awareness. Additionally, Pinto and colleagues used eye tracking software to ensure that all trials where DDC moved his eyes from the focal point, which would thus contaminate the split between the visual half fields, were eliminated from the final dataset. And on top of all of that, as we talked about already, you can read the interviews with these patients where they will say they are not blind to visual information on their left side.
Yeah, so I've tested that extensively with them as well, and just indeed the most straightforward way is like, hey, what would it actually be like if you are, so like, let's say you are now your left hemisphere. Okay, now you're half paralyzed, right? So you are half blind and so on. So I could just say like, hey, can you look at my finger here? Do you see something to the left of your visual field, or do you see something, etc.? So I already did a lab test, of course, where it's not true that they don't see anything there. They actually can report. So they can see. Okay, yes. Okay, before I answer what you just asked, let me just give one thing that I think didn't make it into the paper. So I could indeed replicate the findings of what you see with Joe, where Joe is this famous YouTube clip where something is shown to the left, and he's asked, what did you see? He says nothing, and then draw it with your left hand, and he draws it, right? So this is everybody's like, wow, this proves that there's 2 people in there. And I could kind of replicate that when I first had a naming test, like, hey, I will show you an image on the left or the right. And the patient, when something appeared on the left, he would say, I saw nothing. But then I was like, hey, maybe he says it because he cannot name it. So then I gave the explicit instruction, you should only say that you saw nothing when there was nothing there. If you cannot name it, you have to say, I cannot name it. And then I inserted catch trials where there was really nothing there. And by this small change, all of a sudden, when there was something there, he would always say, he would never miss that there was something there. He could just not name it. And the other thing with what he could do, although he could not name it, he could match it. He could indicate like, hey, what I just saw, if I have to choose from different pictures what I just saw, he could indicate the right picture. And the important thing is he could do that with both his left hand and his right hand. So basically, the idea here with when you see Joe drawing a picture but not naming it, these are different tasks. And the insinuation in this video is he can only do it with his left hand. But you should also try it, of course, with his right hand. So this is what I did, a visual matching task. And it turns out it doesn't matter if he responds with the left hand or the right hand. He can just do a visual matching task, but he cannot name it. So there is a specialization going on, but it's less extreme than being half blind. Anyway, so I also asked them like, hey, how do you experience the world? How do you experience your body and so on? They indicate like, no, if I look at your finger, I see the stimuli to both sides. So I see both visual fields. I feel my entire body. I feel like I'm in control of my entire body. And I also explicitly asked them, like, do you ever have the feeling like, hey, the one part of my body, or sometimes just there's like some kind of alien hand syndrome or whatever, like there's movements being initiated that I don't initiate. And they were like, what? No. So it would be almost like I ask you, like, do you ever have this feeling that half of your body just goes its own way? You'd be like, no, that never happens. And that was their response as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess
Yeah.
that's instructive, you know?
What this study shows is that those original publications about visual half-field agnosia may not have been the full truth, and as we've already talked about, it's hard to pin down what their actual findings were. Sperry admitted in his 1968 paper that there were exceptions to the observations, but in all of those early papers that I was able to find, there's minimal to no raw data, mainly just narrative and interpretation. So not only is it just hard to trust those interpretations, especially when there are rigorous published findings more recently that show something entirely different, but it's pretty much impossible to see what might have been done wrong in those studies, and how those conclusions were reached to in the first place. So all of this brings up a vital question. If there's no communication between the hemispheres of sensory information, how is the patient experiencing unified consciousness? What's the mechanism behind all this? I asked Dr. Pinto, expecting that perhaps this could be explained by some sort of subcortical processing or something like that, but instead, he said this.
Yeah, I mean, anything's on the table, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. So basically, your guess is as good as mine. I
Okay.
basically have no, yeah, I mean, I can speculate, but it's basically an unfounded speculation. So I haven't done any investigation into this. I don't have any data bearing on this topic. But yeah, but it could be anything. I mean,
Hmm.
yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I just want to really check in more detail whether there's evidence for one or two people. I think so far it really supports the idea that it's just one person, even if you cut all this communication.
Hmm.
And then, yeah, then you indeed get into the philosophical question. But honestly, you are there anyway, because even if it would be two people, right? Which I don't think is the case, but let's say you would find that, then would still be really strange that, like, in a way, all the corpus callosum does is exchange information. And
Hmm.
why would it be the case that if you have two people that exchange a lot of information, that they merge into one? Like, if we start
Yeah.
intensively communicating, yeah, I mean, maybe it's logically possible that we merge into one person, but it really seems like why? Like, why would that have? Why wouldn't we just stay two people that exchange a lot of information?
Yeah.
So I think I mean, this is of course these are age-old philosophical questions about like the indivisibility of consciousness and so on.
So we don't know for sure, mechanistically speaking, but as Pinto and colleagues explain at the end of their paper, these findings are in line with a particular theory of consciousness called local recurrent processing theory, which suggests that even if neural activity is not integrated into a larger network of processing, that recurrent interactions between neural areas in isolation is enough to create a conscious experience. In this sense, a split brain patient would be expected to be conscious of all of their sensory experiences regardless of what hemisphere it occurred in, because neither hemisphere acts as the arbiter of conscious experience, but rather the two hemispheres just have different specialities and function. Language and linguistic thought do not define conscious experience, they're just a part of it. We've been talking a lot thus far in terms of conscious experience, and according to the best data I can find, it appears that split brain patients have a unified conscious experience. When someone, whether it be Gazzaniga and Sperry or CGP Grey, talk about a split brain patient experiencing a separate consciousness, this is just not true. But more than that, it is important to not conflate consciousness with identity and sapience. This seems to be the crux of Gray's argument in drawing a distinction between the experiences of the two hemispheres. He saw evidence that there were separate conscious experiences of sensory information, and saw that as evidence that there was a split of identity as well. So let's talk about that. Now, one question that immediately struck me when I was listening to Gray's argument was that if the right hemisphere, as Gray asserts and is central to his argument, can't speak, then how is it answering linguistic questions? In the experiments that Gray demonstrates in his video and that we somewhat explored earlier, the right hemisphere is often being presented with written questions. So, does this mean that the right hemisphere is still communicating with the left through some sort of subcortical connection, enough for the left hemisphere to translate the words into a signal that the right hemisphere can understand? Or is it that the right hemisphere has some language capacity, and if so, to what extent? These seem like pretty big and obvious questions, since the fact of language lateralization is so central to Gray's argument, so I went down that rabbit hole. Rice and colleagues in their 2017 paper on the cross-lateralization of word retrieval showed that from the bottom up, the process of word retrieval is a distributed network. To quote them directly, language cannot be seen as one unitary function that is either intact or uniformly damaged. Instead, it is the sum of sub-processes that rely on distinct underlying physiological functions or factors. Now, it was originally noted by Gazzaniga, Sperry, and their colleagues that the right hemisphere had some limited language capacity, but that it lacked the capacity for complex syntax. This is further explored tangentially by Rice and colleagues, particularly investigating whether right hemispheric structures could be able to aid left hemispheric stroke victims in recovering some of their lost language function. The ability to fluidly speak is no small task from a neurological perspective, and there are a number of processes involved, each of which have to work in tandem with each other for fluid speech production. One of the fundamental building blocks of language production is the process of retrieving words from long-term memory as one speaks, otherwise known as conceptually driven word retrieval. In healthy adults, this process enables the production of 2 to 4 words per second out of a 50 to 100,000 word mental lexicon, with no more than 2 errors every 1,000 words, which is remarkably impressive. This process is enabled by 2 cognitive functions, lexical activation and lexical selection. Lexical activation appears to be necessary for lexical selection, so we'll start there. It's a theory that heralds from an elaboration on Quailian's theory of semantic memory, and was developed by Collins and Loftus in their 1975 paper. According to the theory, lexical activation works as a distributed network. Basically, all concepts are represented as nodes, and each node is a link to other concept nodes, with multiple concept nodes connecting to each other simultaneously. So even for simple concepts, there can be an extremely large number of nodes that connect to it. The connections from one node to another are properties that the two share in common, and this relationship goes in both directions. Any node in the chain could be the central node that activates the spread. Additionally, the brain seems to demonstrate another feature to the system. Not only are concepts connected to one another, but the strength of that connection is also noted, so that the more 2 nodes are activated together, the stronger that link becomes over time. Thus, according to Collins and Loftus, each word in the mental lexicon is represented cognitively as a node, and each time a word is activated, there is a spread of activation to all the other nodes that link to it, and each of these nodes activate the nodes linked to them, and so on. This process leads to lexical selection, which is essentially the process by which the intended word is selected for from the set produced by lexical activation. The theory of lexical selection was developed by Willem Levelt and colleagues over the years of experimental research that they had conducted, and was formally published in Levelt's 2001 paper, in which he outlines not only how words are selected for cognitively, but also how the vocal apparatuses, like your mouth and your vocal cords, are given instructions on how to physically form the word. Now, we won't be getting into the second half of that, which is called form encoding in case you're interested, but suffice it to say, based on numerous findings in the literature, it's clear that the process of finding the word to say and physically speaking the word are 2 separate neurological processes. We'll focus on lexical selection here, which begins with conceptually focusing and perspective taking. Now, when people are asked to perform simple word selection tasks, you can get a vast swath of answers. The example Levelt gives is a picture of a horse may in fact cause the speaker to say horse, or animal, or mammal, or stallion, and the list can go on and on. When we search for the appropriate word to say, we're not just trying to communicate an idea in our head. We're assessing the social situation that we're in and determining what way of saying what we're thinking will serve our communication goal the best. In other words, in the process of spreading activation, we are not just exploring a concept in a vacuum to find the most accurate description of a word or related concept. We're doing so in the context of a broader social setting, which helps to inform both activation and selection. What's really interesting is that perspective taking can also be in terms of self-perspective, though. Lavelle details an experiment where a participant is shown a 2-dimensional drawing, such as this, with different colored dots connected by lines, with a directional arrow pointing at the starting dot and denoting the direction of movement. When the participants are asked to describe the progression from start to end, they don't describe it in literal terms as seen on the paper, which would be straight, right, left. Instead, they describe it in terms of their relative position, as if they were traveling through the scene depicted in the paper like a real terrain. People will respond by starting with saying that you move up from yellow to green, and then up from green to brown, and then you take a right, and then you keep going right, and then after that you go down, and then you take another right. Even though from the perspective of looking at the paper, the black dot is to the left of the red dot, the participants intuitively take the perspective of having traveled this as a terrain and make the logical inference that they would be facing forward the whole time. Lexical selection is therefore both socially and personally relative. You use your sense of self, whether physically or conceptually, as an anchor point, and understand that within a larger social or spatial context. So now that we've established some context, let's see what role the right hemisphere may or may not play in this process. As mentioned earlier, Sperry and Gazzaniga observed that the right hemisphere does have an extended lexicon, but it lacks the ability to decipher the meaning of sentences. And returning to Rice and colleagues' 2017 paper, fMRI studies demonstrate right hemisphere activation in word retrieval. They also explain that if someone has a left hemisphere stroke, obviously they'll have language impairment, but interestingly enough, if that same person then has a right hemispheric stroke, it'll exacerbate that loss of language function. However, due to split brain patients not demonstrating any significant loss of language, it's safe to say that the right hemisphere likely plays a supplementary role rather than a critical one in word retrieval. So the right hemisphere has access to a sizable lexicon, which it likely uses in aiding the left hemisphere in word retrieval, but it can't process language itself beyond the most basic. However, in split brain patients, because the hemispheres are cut off from one another, the brain, in theory, should attempt to reorganize itself to compensate for the loss of function. Because from the perspective of the individual hemispheres, it's as if half of the cortex has been removed. And we do see in hemispherectomy patients that right hemispheres can develop full language capabilities in children if you remove the left hemisphere early on. However, most split brain patients were adults when they had their surgery, so it was unclear to what degree their brains would even be able to adapt. But as the decades went by, some amazing discoveries were made in split brain patients. Patient JW, again, not to be confused with WJ, underwent callosotomy at the age of 26, and at the time was found to have left-lateralized language and speech dominance. In 1996, Gazzaniga and colleagues had JW come in for some more experiments and observed something very interesting. To quote them, around 7 years post-operation, JW's right hemisphere had gained enough access to the left hemisphere speech apparatus to initiate some simple responses, even though the left hemisphere was unaware that its speech system was expressing right hemisphere knowledge. Now, that sounds wild and honestly a bit creepy, and sure as hell like there are two people in one head using the same speech apparatus. But let's take a deeper look and see what this means. The study consisted of 2 experiments under a variety of conditions. Like all other split brain studies, this involved only presenting stimuli to one hemisphere at a time. These tests involved visual tests starting with simple naming tasks. JW's right hemisphere was tested and compared to his left hemisphere as the control condition, and was asked to identify and name neutral images and familiar photographs, moving up to pictures of complex objects. They repeated this procedure with more complex visual images, including simple line drawings, photographs of common objects, photographs of complex objects, drawings of animate scenes that would require more than just single words to describe them fully, and complex inanimate scenes. They also conducted tactile naming procedures following the same thread, but this time JW was asked to feel a set of objects with his left hand and present the experimenter with the requested object. Experimenters would ask for an object using either structural information about its form, descriptions like sharp, soft, long, and round, or functional and associative information such as asking for the one that writes or the one that you can smoke, and so forth. The stimuli were kept out of view, and JW was instructed to give the experimenter the requested object without making a verbal response, after which he was asked to attempt to name the item. A second experiment examined interfield comparisons, asking JW to compare 2 stimuli, one presented in each visual half field, and judge whether or not they were the same. In the first experiment, the right hemisphere was shown to be able to have a higher than chance ability at naming objects in every condition, and the purpose of the second experiment was to eliminate the possibility that these responses were due to the transfer of visual information between the hemispheres. However, keep in mind that the right hemisphere's verbal responses vastly underperformed in comparison to the left hemisphere's verbal responses, so it's not as if full sentences were being spoken by JW's mouth that he was not consciously aware of saying, but rather the results showed that the right hemisphere could produce simple 1 to 2 word descriptions. That being said, the degree of neuroplasticity in an adult brain was extraordinary to say the least. Again, while the right hemisphere was still not shown to do any complex elaboration or produce syntax, its ability to manifest its mental lexicon into spoken words is very impressive. They explained that the reduction in score the more complex the stimuli became is likely a result of the fact that complex scenes couldn't be described or characterized properly by simple single-word responses. They further suggest that we are potentially seeing cooperation between the hemispheres, which would seem likely. When JW would describe stimuli shown to his right hemisphere, he would use full sentences, but Gazzaniga and colleagues posit that the left hemisphere is helping out the right hemisphere by filling in the gaps for the description based off of the 1 to 2 word clues generated by the right hemisphere, suggesting that this is a form of collaboration between the two hemispheres, just not through a neurological connection, but rather the right hemisphere, capable of simple word descriptions, utilizes the vocal apparatus which the left hemisphere then hears and fills in the gaps through its ability to elaborate, which is all integrated fairly seamlessly for the patient. While Gazzaniga and colleagues don't say if they asked JW if he felt as though there were two people talking in this experiment, it's unlikely that this is the case, given that, JW would probably have been pretty freaked out if that's what it felt like and probably would have said something, and I can't imagine that not being published. So it seems as though, even though the two hemispheres are using the same vocal apparatus to voice observations of visual information that they can't share with each other, the person still feels a unity of conscious experience and identity. So let's talk about that. Grey, in his video, brings up many of the experiments we've already talked about conducted by Sperry, Gazzaniga, and colleagues. As a result of their findings, Gazzaniga eventually came up with the theory of the left hemisphere interpreter, and Gazzaniga credits Dr. Elizabeth Phelps, Dr. Janet McAuliffe, and Dr. Margaret Funnell with additional findings in this regard. Grey alludes to this theory when he explains that the split-brain patient will verbally produce incorrect but plausible reasons for why they are now holding an object that was picked up by the left hand outside of the right visual half-field. Grey refers to this as confabulation, but he doesn't stop to ask why humans do this from an evolutionary perspective, nor the advantages it gives our species the majority of the time, nor the implications that this has on his argument in later questions. Rather, he simply points to this as a quirk of the human condition, something that makes us less rational and, by implication, less intelligent and having less agency than we think we do. So it's really no surprise that he sees this as evidence for his belief in the lack of free will and just slides it in there nonchalantly. Now, we've already talked about the evolution of lateralization in the human brain and the clear advantages it gives our species as a whole, but we haven't really dove into the left hemisphere interpreter theory yet. To understand what the left hemisphere interpreter is, we have to discuss the two separate cognitive styles between the hemispheres. The right hemisphere appears to process sensations and perceptions that come in and physically reacts to them and interacts with them, but doesn't seem to do much with that information beyond that, while the left hemisphere seems to elaborate on the information that comes in by drawing associations and searching for logical patterns, even if none are present. The main example pointed to illustrate this is another experiment, this one by Dr. George Wolford. There are multiple variations of this experiment, but the general procedure asks a participant to guess whether a red or green circle will appear on a screen. However, the game is rigged so that the red circle appears 75% of the time in a random sequence. So, the participant can gather very early on that the red circle is being lit up way more often than the green circle. If a participant chooses to try and figure out the pattern, however, called the matching strategy, they can in theory get 100% accuracy, but also can, in theory, achieve a score as low as 50%. However, if the participant simply guesses the red circle every time, they would be correct 75% of the time, and that would be guaranteed. This is called the maximizing strategy, and other animals will adopt this maximizing strategy, while humans tend to prefer the matching strategy. However, when tested in split-brain patients, it appears that the left hemisphere adopts the strategy of trying to deduce the pattern, the matching strategy, while the right hemisphere will only guess the possibility that occurs the most often, the maximizing strategy, just like animal studies. Findings like this seem to suggest that uniquely human cognitive strategies appear to be lateralized, which would be in line with our earlier discussion on preserving old cognitive functions in one hemisphere while gaining new cognitive functions in the other. Now, when Grey talks about the left hemisphere's propensity to confabulate, as he calls it, he's also referring to experiments on false memories in split-brain patients. In one of the classic split-brain experiments, which presented the participants with two large pictures in front of them, one presented to the right hemisphere and the other presented to the left hemisphere, and four small pictures on either side. The picture being presented to the left hemisphere was a chicken foot, and the image being presented to the right hemisphere was a snowed-over house. On the left side of the table, there were four small pictures of various tools, one of which was a snow shovel, and on the right side there were another four small pictures, one of which was a chicken. This was to test the two hemispheres' associative abilities. The left hemisphere with the right hand correctly associated the chicken foot with the picture of the chicken, and the right hemisphere with the left hand correctly selected the picture of the snow shovel for the snowed-over house. When the participant was asked why they had pointed to the shovel with their left hand, they related it to what they had seen in the right visual half field, and explained that the shovel was required to shovel out the chicken coop. Now, a quick note about this experiment: try as I might, I was unable to find the original paper in which this finding was demonstrated. If you search through the literature for this experiment, you'll find a lot of citations leading back to Gazzaniga's 1998 retrospective, and while this article does do a good job condensing and encapsulating the work on split brain patients over the decades and adequately explaining those experiments, it lacks raw data or experimental conditions, things that you would want to see in a paper if you were trying to evaluate the efficacy of an experiment. But at this point, with the lack of raw data in many of the original papers by Gazzaniga and Sperry I was able to find, I really wouldn't be surprised if the original paper for this experiment followed that same trend. Again, we come back to the problem of how universal are these findings in split brain patients. If you manage to find this paper, please sound off in the comments, but keeping all that in mind, I'm just going to go with it and give them the benefit of the doubt on this one and evaluate this experiment as is. Now, you probably remember this experiment from Gray's video, and after demonstrating it, he explains that this finding demonstrates that the left hemisphere is just doing what it does by explaining events and searching for meaning, which is correct, but the implication of this is the important distinction between the two cognitive styles between the hemispheres. These two cognitive styles have very different effects on cognitive functions. With respect to memory, for example, the left hemisphere, which uses information in the present and information that has been committed to memory, to elaborate and search for connections and patterns. But this appears to have a destructive effect on the memories themselves, leading to a loss of fidelity and accuracy over time. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, does not engage in this sort of elaboration, and is thus able to keep a higher fidelity, more accurate copy of the given memory. Similar to Gazzaniga's previously mentioned hypothesis that lateralization allowed for new neural structures to be created without sacrificing old ones over the course of many generations, it appears that lateralization also serves an adaptive cognitive function in the individual along the same lines, being able to elaborate on information without corrupting the only copy stored in memory. Now, it's hard to assert that the right hemisphere experiences consciousness outside of the person's perceived conscious experiences in general, based off of everything that we've talked about already in Dr. Pinto's paper and whatnot, but it's also hard to assert that even if the right hemisphere is experiencing its own consciousness, that it's experiencing consciousness in the same way that the left hemisphere does. Because of these two distinct cognitive styles, the right hemisphere simply lacks the cognitive strategies and neurological structures necessary to elaborate on information, and thus does not have a sense of self, because a sense of self is an elaboration on experiences and memories. Now, here we're really getting into the core of the matter. What is identity in relationship to consciousness? Now, we've been skirting around this distinction for the whole video, so it's time we dove into it. Hell yeah, only 10,000 some odd words and an hour into the video, and we are finally getting into the sexy part, operationalization. Now that's a prickish sounding word, so what the hell does it mean? When we make an operational definition of something, we're defining a concept in a way that we can measure or otherwise observe in a scientific setting. If you're trying to measure something like stress, you can operationalize that by measuring markers of stress, like cortisol levels, blood pressure, and heart rate. Or you could operationalize it with self-reports from participants on a quantitative 1 to 5 scale, something like that. Simply put, operationalization is the creation of a clearly defined, workable definition that you can observe. Identity and the self are unsurprisingly difficult things to operationalize. They're very relative and subjective things, and because psychologists can't leave a thing well enough alone, of course we have some attempts at operationalizing it. In their 1997 paper, Kilstrom and Klein attempted to define the self from a cognitive perspective. They posit that identity can be defined through the relationship created between conscious experience, past or present, and the mental representation of the self as an agent or experiencer of those events, which kind of mirrors our previous discussion on lexical selection and perspective taking. Now, according to this, your sapient experience is a relationship between your sense of self and the world around you. Knowledge and memory are obviously central to this idea, knowledge of oneself and knowledge of the events that you experience. They propose that knowledge of oneself can be broadly categorized into 4 types, the first of which being the self as a concept comprising fuzzy sets of context-specific selves. Now, the concept of fuzzy sets suggests that perceived similarities between items automatically puts them into a mental category, even when those similarities are purely superficial. Within this idea of fuzzy sets, people create what are called category prototypes, which define the category by possessing all or most of the relevant characteristics. For example, let's take the category of dog. Intuitively, there is a prototypical dog in your mind by which all other potential dogs are judged to see if they fit the category. Now, Kihlstrom and Klein ask whether or not this framework can be applied to self-knowledge, because by definition there can only be one category member for the self. They cite Epstein's 1973 theory-driven view of categorization, which broadly states that theories about oneself are made in the background and are part of broader theories about one's entire range of experience. So, in a broader social sense, our experiential links to others becomes a theory of how we became what we are. So, similarities inferred in creating the concept of the self as a category are inherently experiential and social. Basically, according to this view, the idea of the self is inherently interconnected with all other types of knowledge about the social world. You, as a concept, are not created and do not exist in a vacuum. Identity is driven by your interactions with others and serves as an anchor that connects a vast array of different experiences and your way of acting within different environments. Now, the second concept that the self can be categorized by is as a set of narratives addressing one's past, present, and future. Kihlstrom and Klein argue that knowledge takes the form of narrative, not just with autobiographical memories, but even semantic knowledge. They argue that non-story knowledge is not truly knowledge, but more like a form of indexing to organize and locate stories. Now, if you think about it, context is pretty essential to memory. Thinking back to the concept of semantic activation, the more related concepts you have to a central node, the higher the chances that that node in question can be activated by an increasing number of stimuli. Much the same, Kihlstrom and Klein argue that narrative is inherently tied to memory. If you understand a concept or term within a broader context, there emerges a story that you can contextualize an otherwise solitary fact within, and thereby more nodes are created that can activate the node that you want to access. The third concept that Kihlstrom and Klein argue for is the self as an image or other perception-based representation containing the face, body, and gesture information. They explain that there are two forms of mental representation, meaning and perception. They cite that it is well established that we have perception-based representations of other people, and so it seems to follow that we would have such for ourselves as well. Body schemas are mental models for one's body, giving you an anchor for your interactions with your environment. And the last concept that they posit is that the self is an associative network that contains information about personality traits, autobiographical memories, thoughts, and behaviors separated between episodic and semantic knowledge, or memories about things that have happened to you, and knowledge about traits about yourself. This one is a bit more complicated to unpack than the others, but remember back to our discussion of lexical activation. It's the same basic concept. By definition, episodic memory ties to self-concept. However, so can semantic memory, in the sense of keeping record of non-experiential knowledge about yourself, such as physical and psychological traits that aren't tied to a specific memory per se. Kihlstrom and Klein relate self-memory to the research on how we store memories about other people in an associative network. Within this sort of associative network, the person, on some basic level like their name or face, is the central node from which knowledge radiates out in a distributed, interconnected network of knowledge and relationships. According to some of the work on spreading activation, the number of nodes that can easily be created in relation to one person creates a problem called the fan effect. The more you know about a person, or any other concept for that matter, the longer it takes to retrieve a particular item of information. One potential solution is that organization of knowledge can reduce or eliminate the fan effect. However, that's a theory that Kihlstrom and Klein cite as having some controversial experimental evidence. Now, applying this general framework of distributed networks to the self, there are three possibilities to generalize from person memory to memory of the self. The first being that memory for specific behavioral episodes or memories is organized by trait implications, or in other words, what the specific event in your life implies about the kind of person you are. In this sense, fanning off from the central node of the self are traits about yourself like creative or introverted or conscientious, and off of those trait nodes are episodes that demonstrate those behaviors. The second possibility is the reverse, that off of the central node of the self, fan-specific memories and specific knowledge about traits are linked indirectly through those experiences. and the third possibility being that episodes and semantic knowledge are encoded separately. Knowledge of behavior is separate from knowledge about traits. An experiment to test these three models by Klein and Loftus used what's called a priming paradigm. If one cognitive process precedes another, then the first process will result in the second one being achieved quicker. The one will prime the other. To test whether or not self-knowledge is organized by traits or episodes first, they used trait adjectives as probes for participants paired with a combination of 2 out of 3 possible tasks. Define the adjective. This acted as the neutral task because it was not primed to be in relation to self-knowledge. The second being describe the trait adjective in relation to oneself, and the third being recall an instance where one displayed that trait adjective. Each trial had participants perform 2 out of the 3 tasks in sequence for each trait adjective. Describe, then recall, define, then recall then describe, etc., with a total of 9 possible sequences, the response time on the second question being what was measured for. So if describing coming before recalling resulted in faster response than recall and then describe, then that would mean that traits prime memories, meaning that self-knowledge is organized in that way, and vice versa for recall to describe. However, it turned out that neither primed the other, meaning that self-descriptions and autobiographical memory are represented independently of one another. This was supported by Dr. Endel Tulving in 1993, who reported that a patient with complete retrograde and anterograde amnesia, meaning that he couldn't remember any past events or make new memories, was able to provide an accurate semantic description of his personality as compared to his mother's assessment, despite having no episodic memories to base his self-conception on. Conway and Pledel-Pierce in their 2000 study proposed a self-memory system, or SMS, for autobiographical memory, where there is a knowledge base and a set of control processes. The knowledge base contains layers of autobiographical knowledge, ranging from conceptual to abstract to clear details of specific events. Access to the knowledge base is mediated by the control process, called the working self. So essentially, the control process generates goals and evaluates responses to those goals to direct autobiographical memory retrieval. Now, according to Turk in his 2003 paper, the working self seems to be located in the left prefrontal cortex and conceptually resembles Gazzaniga's left hemisphere interpreter module. There are, however, disagreements in the literature on this topic, with some studies demonstrating more right hemispheric activation during autobiographical memory retrieval. Turk argues that while these disagreements in the literature might be because of methodological differences, they might in fact not be contradictory findings at all, proposing that both findings might show parts of a complex system where the left prefrontal cortex creates goals and regions of the right hemisphere gather the requested memory. This would make sense with respect to the separate cognitive styles theory we discussed earlier. If the left hemisphere interpreter can elaborate on memories, but at the cost of the loss of memory fidelity, and the right hemisphere stores more accurate copies of memories and doesn't do any elaborative processing, then when the working self creates a goal-directed memory request, it would make sense that the right hemisphere would be the preferred place to pull accurate memories from. But wait, Jordan, I hear you saying. If you're saying that understanding oneself as a part of a larger social context is essential to identity, then what about the fact that Gray said that the left hemisphere can't understand faces? Well, would you be surprised if I told you that that was wrong? Not incomplete, just wrong. It is true that the right hemisphere specializes in facial recognition, but the left hemisphere can still identify them. However, while the right hemisphere specializes in recognizing the faces of others, do you want to guess what hemisphere specializes in recognizing one's own face? None other than the left hemisphere. In Turk and colleagues' 2002 experiment, Mike or Me, which Gazzaniga was actually a co-author on, by the way, split-brain patient JW, who you'll remember from before, was tested on lateralized facial recognition, using the same visual half-field isolation as all the other experiments that we've talked about. Turk and colleagues presented JW's different hemispheres with 11 separate photographs in a spectrum. On one side of that spectrum was a photograph of JW himself, and on the other side of that spectrum was a photo of Michael Gazzaniga. The other 9 photos were morphed photographs of the two faces, starting with 90% JW and 10% Gazzaniga, and ending with 10% JW and 90% Gazzaniga. The results showed that the right hemisphere has a bias for seeing familiar others in the faces of a morphed photograph, while the left hemisphere has a bias for seeing the self in a morphed photograph. Crucially, both hemispheres were able to identify both faces at the extreme ends of the spectrum, so the right hemisphere was able to recognize its own face, and the left hemisphere was able to recognize the face of a familiar other. They even repeated this procedure 3 more times to make sure that the results were not dependent on the identity of the familiar other, using photographs of another personally known individual to JW, as well as at the time President Bush and former President Clinton, all of which showed the same results. These findings showed the idea that while the right hemisphere is undoubtedly capable of self-recognition, it is the left hemisphere that specializes in this process. And it also implies that self-conception and social cognition are separate processes. Why would that be? Well, Turk's paper on the subject, published the following year, which we've been diving into already, asserts that self-identity is a special cognitive process. Now, as you can probably tell, this paper is pretty central to my research. If you take a look at my conspiracy board, we should probably do it a little bit sooner than that. As you can probably tell, this paper is pretty central to my research. Now, if you take a look on my conspiracy board, as it inches ever closer. Stop. It's good. It's good.
Can I have a marker?
Gaff tape. If you don't have it, you need it. Now, as you can probably tell, this paper is pretty central to my research. If you take a look at my conspiracy board right here, this is the paper we're talking about. If you see here at the bottom are all of my citations, and these 2 papers in particular have a lot of connections. This is one of them. The other one was Dr. Pinto's paper, which we already talked about. So, just like Dr. Pinto, I reached out to Dr. Turk for an interview, but unfortunately, he let me know that he was way too busy, which is fair. He's a professor, and it was the end of the spring semester, and he also reminded me that he wrote this paper like 20 years ago, so he wasn't sure how much use he would be to me in the interview, which makes sense. This is not the only thing he's ever researched, and he's got other questions he's interested in answering. I guess in my head, I just imagined that after pouring over a week into researching this paper and taking meticulous notes, I was just hoping that the person who wrote it would email me back and help me tie it all together in a nice little bow. I just figured he was as into his paper as I am, but you know, he's got better things to do than be thinking about the same question for 20 years. So Dr. Turk, if you end up seeing this, know that you're an inspiration to me to know when to move on, and I greatly appreciate you getting back to me. Where'd it go? So let's see if we can unpack this paper for ourselves. Turk argues that self-knowledge is distinct from other representations of knowledge. In support of this, he cites the well-documented phenomenon of self-knowledge having a memory advantage over other knowledge, in that it is retrieved with higher fidelity, greater volume of detail, and more quickly. Self-recognition tasks and familiar other recognition tasks have both been shown to increase activation of the left inferior frontal cortex over control conditions. However, the level of activation didn't differ between the two, even though self-judgments yield clearer memory. So it seems as though memory of familiar others and self-memory has ties to left-lateralized structures, but there must be some other structure at play to explain the self-memory advantage. Later findings showed that self-referential judgments selectively activated regions of the medial prefrontal cortex as opposed to the familiar other references. Activity of the medial prefrontal cortex was found to be critical in predicting whether a word judged in reference to oneself would be remembered later, making it fundamentally different from other forms of semantic processing. Now, tying all this back into the left hemisphere interpreter, it hasn't been really possible to determine if a left-lateralized base for self-referential information processing exists in healthy brains. One difficulty noted about studying these kinds of functions in intact brains is what's called the contamination problem, or the fact that complete isolation of a process in the intact brain is very difficult. The brain, as it would seem, wants to be as integrated as possible, and one could argue that this is a good indication of the holistic, distributed, integrated nature of neural processes and cognition, and further to the point, the limitations of generalizing findings in pathologized brains to healthy brains. That being said, the split brain provides the ability to isolate the hemispheres of the cortex to determine hemispheric lateralization of the self. Linguistic-based questions obviously lend themselves to the left hemisphere, so experiments to determine a left lateralization of the self have to employ other methods. For example, mental rotation studies demonstrated that the left hemisphere had an advantage when the reference point was egocentric, that being oneself, while the right hemisphere had an advantage with spatial information relative to an external or allocentric frame. And studies show that neurologically intact patients show regions involved in motor planning and preparation are activated during egocentric rather than allocentric rotation. And as we discussed, Turk and colleagues tested facial recognition in the split brain, showing a left-lateralized self bias. All in all, it does seem that the sense of self, and more specifically Conway and Plato-Pierce's theory of the working self and Gazzaniga and colleagues' theory of the left hemisphere interpreter, is potentially in fact a left-lateralized function, and would also make sense in light of the first finding in split brain patients, that their personality and sense of identity remained intact after the split. So, in the split brain, we've already demonstrated that consciousness is undivided. But like I said earlier, consciousness and sapience are not necessarily the same thing, and it would appear that the sense of self, having an identity with which to anchor yourself to your conscious experiences, is a lateralized function that the right hemisphere does not demonstrate. This would explain why split brain patients don't lose a part of their personality after the split, because it was always a localized processing function, and why after the right hemisphere adapts some ability to control the vocal apparatus, it does not begin to express identity or elaboration on its experiences, key components of a sense of self. So, both with respect to consciousness and sapience, it is clear that split brain patients remain undivided. Now, one could perhaps still make the argument that under the right circumstances, a callosotomy could result in two personalities. Perhaps if the patient was young enough for the brain to have enough neuroplasticity for both hemispheres to develop typically left-lateralized structures. But even though that is definitely not what we see in the split brain population studied to date, Grey, in his self-described speculation time, posits that even in the intact brain, there are two entities. Now, in the split brain, of course, the two hemispheres are not communicating with each other, and are therefore processing information separately, even though this is all still integrated into the conscious experience of the person, as we've talked about. The fact remains that the hemispheres and their specialized functions can't interact with each other. And the point I'm arguing here is that there does not suddenly become a separate sense of self in the right hemisphere. You are not two in any meaningful sense of the word you. The right hemisphere, across all of Gazzaniga's and others' experiments, repeatedly demonstrates the lack of problem-solving abilities and lack of cohesive narrative of self. It responds to simulation and whatever goal direction cues it can find, but it does not conceive for itself an identity. Another consistent finding of Gazzaniga and colleagues is that each split-brain patient shows no change in temperament, personality, or cognitive ability. If there were structures in the right hemisphere that were essential to identity and sense of self, patients would be noticeably changed and probably be able to describe the difference. But instead, we see the opposite. All the way back to Achaladis' studies. Patients repeatedly claim that they are still the same person and they don't feel like there is another person living in the same body with them. Their sense of agency, continuity, and identity is preserved and continues just as it did prior to the split. Clearly, both halves of the brain are not doing half the work of being you in any meaningful sense, as Grey asserts. What split brain patients are consistently shown to be left with is minor impairments in specific functions barely noticeable in normal life, and only really identifiable under specific laboratory conditions. Additionally, in Grey's speculation on the evidence, he not only asserts that the split brain patients have a dual consciousness, but that even in intact brains, there's a dual consciousness and identity between the hemispheres. This is why I harped so much on the framing of the two hemispheres as two brains, because when you talk about the two hemispheres as two brains, you can easily come to this conclusion. But, in light of the fact of the contamination problem, with intact brains demonstrating the constant and extremely seamless communication, cooperation, and integration of the hemispheres via the commissures, it is really hard to argue that they are separate conscious entities when they are connected. Now, Grey accounts for this problem in his argument by crafting a narrative about the two hemispheres, where in the early stages of life, they are two equal partners, but after the language becomes fully established, the language having left hemisphere dominates the right hemisphere, which just goes along with it. Grey then draws the conclusion that since the part of us that we think of as ourselves is the left hemisphere, because the central nature of language, the fact that we don't think that there are two people in our heads means that the other person must be aware of this one-sided partnership. And so, when the corpus callosum is severed, the right hemisphere is fully aware of the distinction, because it has been from the start. And thus, while your left hemisphere is having its mind equals blown moment, your right hemisphere is rolling its eyes at you. This doesn't make any sense. If the left hemisphere is unaware of another conscious entity in the same head with it, why would the right hemisphere be any more aware of the situation it's in? Grey seems to imply that this is because the left hemisphere is doing all the talking, while the right hemisphere can hear it, but since the right hemisphere is mute, it can't make its presence known. But if the right hemisphere has no language beyond the most basic, how does it know what is going on with the language-dominant left? Mind you, this is an evaluation of Grey's argument within his own logic. Going back to the evidence of the left hemisphere interpreter, a theory developed by the main researcher Grey cites, the left hemisphere's elaborative abilities make it more aware of every situation it's in than the right hemisphere, because it is structures within the left hemisphere that creates a self-relevant meaning to otherwise straightforward information inputs, and then integrates that meaning into a larger narrative of the self. The right hemisphere, which again has been demonstrated consistently to lack this elaborative ability and to generally be more conservative in preserving rather than tampering with its information inputs, does not seem to demonstrate this ability to craft a narrative of self. And even when the right hemisphere ceases to be mute, when you cease to have a silent passenger, and his language abilities adapt and increase over time, as demonstrated with patient JW, the patient does not report there to be a separate entity, nor does the right hemisphere assert an identity for itself using its newfound vocal apparatus. Pair all this with the consistent flow of information and seamless integration between the two hemispheres in neurologically intact people, and there is literally no reason to draw the conclusion that Grey does in his speculation segment. In all the experimental settings that we have discussed today, the right hemisphere in split-brain patients does not express goal-oriented behaviors, and it is likely that the sense of self is a left-lateralized function. Pair that with Pinto and colleagues' finding that split-brain patients are aware of their entire field of sensory input, even if they cannot integrate that information from one hemispheric input to the specialized cognitive output of the other hemisphere, and also the numerous accounts of split-brain patients who describe their subjective experience of life to be largely the same, with the same degree of conscious unity that they had before. It seems very unlikely that you are too, in light of the evidence. I genuinely don't want this video to seem like I'm just taking shots at Grey personally. Like I said at the beginning of the video, this is not meant to be a hit piece. It's not a reason to dislike or distrust CGP Grey in his videos. To be very honest with you, Grey has been a formative creator for me personally, and I've taken a lot of inspiration from his work and his research ethos over the years. I still get excited to watch his videos, and I have a lot of really fond memories listening to Hello Internet. Couldn't get into Cortex though. I tried, but it wasn't for me. But this, at the end of the day, is a disagreement of interpretation of evidence. When we talk about consciousness, what it means to be oneself, these are not simple questions. The process of researching for this video was hands down harder than any research project I ever did in college, and I want to formally thank and apologize to my roommate, my mom, and my girlfriend for putting up with me ranting about it for the last 3 months. The question of identity is a complex one to unpack, both on a conceptual level and a personal level. The formative years of people's lives often centers around that question. And as far back as you look into oral and written records, people have been trying to answer what it means to be what we are, and what it means to consciously observe the world around us and ourselves, and to be able to find meaning in all that. The last 100 years have been a truly revolutionary time in human history in this regard, because we are just now finally developing the tools and techniques to gather evidence required to answer these questions from a mechanistic perspective, and we are still very much on the forefront of it. What we do know so far is that from a neurological standpoint, you can't point to one part of the brain and say, this is you and that's not. If the left medial prefrontal cortex, that hypothesized center of the self we were talking about earlier, was removed from your brain, what would be left would not be the person we knew before. All the information and construction of perceptions and language would not have a final stop to be processed and condensed down into a singular sense of self. There would no longer be continuity of the narrative. But by that same merit, if we took that left medial prefrontal cortex and put it in a jar and managed to keep it alive somehow, that wouldn't be the person we knew before either. Sure, based on the evidence, it's probably essential for creating the narrative of the self, but without access to memory, to language, to sensations and perceptions, to remove that part of you from the larger context would also fail to preserve the whole person. Consciousness, the sense of self, it's all very gestalt. The whole is in fact greater than the sum of its parts. The real tragedy about all this may be the reaction to those early split brain findings and the impact that has had on the treatment of epilepsy and thousands of people who suffer from it.
So this has very far-reaching consequences. You can find it in any textbook, like psychology students all learn this, etc. Okay, but then and then it turns out to be based on findings that are basically just not true. So that's in that sense, on a theoretical level, very bad. And then the other thing, which is even, in my view, even worse, is that, okay, so why is this procedure done at all? This is to alleviate otherwise untreatable epileptic seizures. And because of, I mean, I don't know, so I should look into this more. So I'm not close enough to neurosurgeons to know this as a fact, but it seems to me at least a possibility that these neurosurgeons hear of these findings. So callosotomy is no longer used as a treatment for seizures. So they do use it still, but then, okay, so here's the thing is, like, if you get lots of epileptic seizures, your IQ drops, your overall functioning goes down, and they wait very long. So they're like, hey, callosotomy is too extreme. So they only do it at the point that people basically have lost all higher cognitive functioning. So they can no longer respond and so on. So they're very far gone. And then, as a last resort, they do it. And I think it could have something to do with the findings of Sperry and Gazzaniga. Yeah, so this is kind of off the table. I'm not sure it's because of these findings, but I can imagine that it is. And the alternative, so they, of course, if you have severe epilepsy, what they always do is give you drugs, so to see if it alleviates it, but that doesn't always help.
Yeah.
Then they go into neurosurgery, but that's not uncomplicated. So let's say you have, generally the way it works with epilepsy is that it starts at one point and it spreads throughout the entire cortex, and then you have a generalized seizure. And cutting corpus callosum is very effective because now it stays locked in one hemisphere, and you have a partial seizure. Okay, but let's say what they generally do is they want to find where does it start, where's the instability, and cut it away. But this could be, let's say, on your eye nerves. So now, if I cut it away, you may end up blind. And then it would be great to know, like, no, we don't have to do that. We can also do callosotomy. Or and sometimes, there are several origins in one hemisphere. So another thing that is on the table, especially in younger kids, is a hemispherectomy. So they don't do callosotomy, but they remove the entire right hemisphere.
I actually came across some of that. Yeah,
and actually callosotomy, in my point of view, is much, much less extreme and should be back on the table. So I do think it's, long story short, I do think it has been detrimental, and they should not have published their findings in this sense without, all the context.
The fact that we as humans confabulate, that we create stories out of the information inputs our brains receive, that's not a silly quirk or a bug about us, it's a feature. That is us. And I think this gets at the core of the difference in ethos between me and CGP Grey. By all accounts, he seems like a very decent guy who would probably be very fun to have a coffee with, and Grey, if you're watching, I hope you had a good time watching. But I will say, while he's definitely not the good little worker robot he's gained the reputation of being over the years, I have consumed enough of his content to get the impression that he at least feels a little bit annoyed by the human condition, constantly trying to optimize and perfect his experience of the world through streamlining it, whereas I, on the other hand, love the idiosyncrasies of the human condition. We humans can be messy, too messy at times, but at the end of the day, I still think there's too much beauty to be had in our imperfections to want to imagine a world without them, or try and explain them away and strip them of their value. The self is a narrative continuously crafted through distributed networks of processing. Without that, we wouldn't be having this discussion, because there would be no discussion to be had. If there's no narrative tying it all together, there's no self. The self is a story we make about everything we experience. Putting aside all of the neuroscience, all of the distributed networks, forget about all that. Who are you? When I ask you that question, what comes to mind? There's a narrative of the self. And just like any complicated narrative, sometimes it's hard to find the thread, to come up with a concise synopsis. You are all of your experiences, all of your thoughts, all of your memories. But you are something more. You are a combination of all of those things. You are what you think you are. And at the end of the day, isn't that what matters? We can conduct all the scientific inquiries we want into the processes that enable the human experience, but at the end of the day, it is still an experience. It's subjective, and it's beautiful. Why try and tarnish that beauty by contriving some mind equals blown moment by attempting to cast doubt on the importance of the subjectivity of self? You are not two. You are you. And the experiences that you have and the story you inevitably create about yourself, that is you. As far as I'm concerned, nobody gets to tell you that isn't as important as you think it is.